Now, I think the most exciting thing to me back when Disney bought Lucasfilm and took over Star Wars was the promise made by them that we'd get one single and consistent continuity or canon going forward. That henceforth, every story told, no matter where it was from, would line up or at the very least not conflict with every other story that had come before or that would come after. That this would, I guess you could say, feel like a vast, living and breathing history of a galaxy far, far away. And no, that's not to say the old expanded universe didn't do a pretty good job of this, at keeping things consistent. And I know some will point out that the Clone Wars animated series was the biggest wrecker of expanded universe continuity there was. Anyway, that's not to say the old expanded universe didn't do a decent job, or that I was happy to see it go, or learn it was going to be replaced or rebranded as Legends. I'm only saying I understood their decision not to beholden themselves to decades of pre-existing material, and to basically wipe the board clean and to have a fresh start. And at the time I thought, or hoped, the new canon might borrow some elements or major beats from the old expanded universe, and give us some stories that were a blend of new and old, that they do something to recognize and appreciate the fans of the old expanded universe who had been supporting Star Wars outside of the movies for decades in some cases. And I guess in a weird sort of way, we got that by them, in a sense, turning the sequel trilogy into a different take on the Dark Empire comics from back in the 90s. And that was a story that saw Palpatine return as a clone, which, thanks to the novelization of The Rise of Skywalker, we've learned is how he came back in the movies. We've also learned, thanks to that book, that Rey was actually the daughter of a failed, non-identical clone of Palpatine, not so much actually the granddaughter of the real Palpatine. And why they did that, why they didn't just keep it simple and have her be the real granddaughter of the real Palpatine, I have no idea. Because what they gave us is so strange and contrived, not to mention just plain silly, I think, that I don't get it. I don't get why you'd overcomplicate the story and, in my opinion, lessen the impact and add a degree or two of separation between Rey and the real Palpatine. And when I talked about this in a video the other day, I had some people asking me what's the big deal, or why does it even matter if she's his real granddaughter? We can still construe it to make what's said in the movie true, that she's his granddaughter, if we consider the failed clone to be like a son to the real Palpatine. And if you want to look at it that way, go for it. I'm not here to tell you what you can and can't like. But imagine if back in the day when Empire Strikes Back came out, we had that classic scene where Vader tells Luke that he's his father, and Luke screams back, "No, that's not true, that's impossible." And Vader says back, "Well, yeah, technically you're not my son, but you're the son of a failed clone of mine. That wasn't an identical clone of mine, because the one we made wasn't force sensitive and didn't do any real bad stuff, actually. He, in all reality, was a good-natured clone, and so you can now kind of feel liberated from that whole sins of the father thing, but in a way you're like my son, so the story can still work, right?" Anyway, all joking aside here, again, if you liked the overly complicated and contrived story that the sequel trilogy turned out to be, that's fine. It really is to each their own. And I'm certainly not saying I don't like a little mystery or intrigue or a strange twist here and there, but this is all a bit much, especially considering most of these revelations came about after the fact. Meaning, for one, they're not touched on in the movies themselves, but for another, I really don't think J.J. Abrams and company thought out all these details themselves. Like Rey being the daughter of a failed clone, I think probably Abrams and company were genuinely going for her being the granddaughter of Palpatine. But either way, they left it to someone else to fill in the many blanks or to answer the lingering questions, which means you might think it was something the Lucasfilm Story Group was on top of and decided. But that's not how the story group works, and more on how they do work in just a little bit. In fact, at least one member of that story group, Matt Martin, didn't even seem to know about the whole Rey is the daughter of a failed clone of Palpatine thing. He even initially, on Twitter a few days ago, thought someone must be referring to a clickbait article when he was asked about it, as if someone was messing with him by suggesting something so crazy that Rey's the daughter of a failed clone. And kinda in Matt's defense here, who seems like a decent enough guy and Star Wars fan from all I've ever seen of him, he said he didn't work on the movies and hence didn't work on the novelization, though he said he read the first or second draft of the book and it wasn't in there. Still, you'd think someone around the office may have mentioned it to him, or he himself would have gone out of his way to get the final scoop on Rey's parents, not just out of his own curiosity's sake, but also because it is literally part of his job to know the ins and outs of the Star Wars galaxy better than most, if not better than pretty much everyone else out there, save the rest of the story group. But again, that's not exactly how they work. Matt Martin himself has said before that the story group is more about story and franchise development, and that keeping continuity is only a small part of that, and certainly not the most important part of that, and that they feel quality of story outweighs the importance of keeping everything perfectly aligned or from contradicting. But I'd argue a big part of what makes a story good in the first place is it not contradicting itself. I even said a few videos back now, and I'll say it again here, that I tend to value consistency over the quality of the story. I'd rather have one dud story in a larger universe, one that stays consistent, over a good story that ignored or undoes much of what came before, and thus not only ruins previous stories, but makes me care less about future ones because they likely won't make sense in the grand scheme of things either. To me, consistency is one of those things that once it starts to unravel, it's likely going to come entirely undone. And once that happens, once what transpires in one part of the story has no bearing on or doesn't have to acknowledge what transpires elsewhere, you don't have a larger story anymore. I mean, what is the point of a shared universe if the continuity of that universe, which you could argue is what makes it special, is lost? Because if you don't have to remain consistent, if you don't prioritize that, you don't have a shared universe anymore. You have loosely connected stories, which ruins the overall immersion. Because arguably, or in my opinion, one of the best parts of the shared universe idea is knowing that no matter what you're reading or watching, it's all part of this much larger story or tapestry. That in theory, the Han Solo I'm reading about in a comic book is the exact same character I saw on the big screen. That, I would wager, is what makes the shared universe concept truly enjoyable for most people. And I'm by no means saying here that I think just because something is perfectly consistent that it's going to be good, or that a story cannot be good unless it's perfectly consistent, or that being consistent should be a valid defense for a mediocre story. In theory, we should get both out of every Star Wars movie, book, comic, or whatever it is. What I'm saying here is don't destroy the Star Wars canon for the sake of one story, no matter how great that story might be, and especially don't do it if the story wasn't great and you're just trying to fix a giant blunder. Because the canon, what happened before, makes up the foundation of the entire universe. The canon is Star Wars. So if you start to reframe or recontextualize past events or characters, or worse yet, just flat out change things, then you're taking away or changing what made me care about the story in the first place. So why would I care about how you want to continue it? Not long ago in Marvel Comics, there was this whole thing with Captain America actually being a sleeper Hydra agent the whole time. And as far as I could tell, I didn't really keep up with it because it didn't interest me. It didn't seem to go over too well with fans. And that's because what made the character great in the first place for so many fans was changed or taken away. Something very similar happened with Luke in The Last Jedi. And as I've said so many times before, if you liked the way he was in that movie, if you thought he was more human or whatever, that's great. I have no problem with you. I respect your opinion. But just understand and respect that for many people, changing the character like that changed what they liked about the character in the first place. You took away what he represented to them, and they didn't appreciate that. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off track. So going back to the story group, I think many people are under this impression that they actually come up with the stories, that they sit around a table, come up with ideas, and dictate those ideas to others and oversee the projects. That is not even close to what they do. In fact, Pablo Hidalgo, another member of the story group, has said they're more like creative facilitators than anything else. They sit down with those who want to tell stories, whether that be books, comics, games, or whatever, and make sure that what they want to do works not only with the continuity, but thematically within Star Wars. That it's not something that's been done before or being worked on elsewhere. And though I could certainly be wrong here, I don't get the sense they have any actual power or authority, especially over those making the movies. Sure, maybe they can tell a comic book writer, no, you can't do that, but I don't think they got to sit down and read the scripts for the sequel trilogy films and say, you can't do this to J.J. Abrams and or Rian Johnson. There were even those comments made by Johnson about a week ago where he talked about how he doesn't really care about the bigger picture, only telling his individual story. And so that's probably the biggest problem with Star Wars right now. There is no true ultimate authority. There is no George Lucas with absolute veto power. At least no one who has a deep, intimate love and understanding of the property. Because obviously Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, and her Disney overlords can do what they want, but I don't think any of them have a deep, profound love for the franchise. There was even an interview several years back now where Kennedy was asked if she had always been a fan of Star Wars, and she said something about how she'd always appreciated what it had meant to the film industry, the importance of it. In other words, she swung and missed at the easiest to hit underhand lob in history, because the automatic answer to that question from the president of Lucasfilm is yes, I have always been a fan of Star Wars. Though I guess we should give her credit for being honest. But the sad thing is, that's the woman running Lucasfilm, someone who appreciates what Star Wars meant to the industry, who said they approached Episode 7 no differently than any other big tentpole movie, and she also no doubt appreciates it because of what it's done for her career and her bank account in the years she's been running the show. Anyway, to wrap this up, no, the Lucasfilm Story Group does not do what many people think it does. They're not running the story or making any real calls, nor are they continuity cops who above all else make sure the new canon remains as consistent as humanly possible, nor do they even all apparently know what's going on with some of the biggest current reveals, like who or what Rey's father truly is. So I guess I'll end by asking them, what would you say you do here? Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about all this. Is the lack of some type of, shall we say, overlord or lords who determine the stories the biggest problem? Or in theory, can it work the way they've been doing it? Can you have everyone telling their own stories and a group that exists to, I guess, kind of help out and keep things from being too contradictory? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.